I never thought I'd live to see the day when a superpower is forced to do the one thing a superpower must never do: ask its rivals for help while pretending it doesn't need them. That moment has arrived. America is about to lose Venezuela, not through military defeat, not through economic sanctions that work, but through the systematic collapse of the very mechanisms that allowed it to project power in the first place. And the irony, the historical structural irony, is that this collapse is not happening because Venezuela is strong. It's happening because America has become dependent on a system it can no longer control. Let me be direct. What we are witnessing right now in Venezuela is not a regional crisis. It is not even primarily about oil. It is the visible crack in the foundation of American hegemony. And when you look closely at that crack, you see three names written in it: Beijing, Moscow, and Tehran. This is not morality. This is not ideology. This is the logic of survival playing out in real time. For 40 years, the United States maintained absolute control over Venezuela through a simple mechanism: the dollar. Venezuela needed dollars. Venezuela's currency was worthless. Venezuela's oil was priced in dollars. The United States controlled the global banking system through which those dollars flowed. Therefore, the United States controlled Venezuela. It was elegant. It was structural. It required no troops. It required no invasion. It required only that the rest of the world accept one fundamental truth: you cannot survive without access to the American financial system. Venezuela's government understood this. Every regional rival understood this. Every banker in London and Frankfurt understood that. The power was not in the guns. The power was in the architecture. Then something shifted. In 2023, the United States imposed its most severe sanctions package on Venezuela since the Trump administration. The goal was simple and explicit: suffocate the regime by cutting it off from dollar transactions, destroy its ability to sell oil, force a collapse, force a regime change. This had worked before. This had worked in Iran. This had worked in North Korea. Or so American planners believed. But Venezuela did not collapse. Instead, something else happened. Something that reveals the structural weakness of American power. Venezuela turned east. Not in desperation, not as a last resort, but as a deliberate strategic choice enabled by rivals who had spent the last decade preparing for exactly this moment. By late 2024, Venezuela was selling 70% of its crude oil to China, not at a discount, not under duress, but as part of a long-term partnership agreement. The oil was no longer priced primarily in dollars. It was priced in yuan. It was settled through Chinese banking channels. It was no longer subject to American financial weaponization. The United States had imposed sanctions designed to isolate Venezuela from the global economy. Instead, it had isolated itself from access to Venezuelan oil. This is not a small thing. This is not a regional setback. This is a fundamental reversal of how American power functions. And the fact that American policymakers are only now beginning to understand this is the most dangerous part of all. Let me explain why this happened. Because it requires understanding something most American analysts refuse to accept. The United States does not have a strength problem in Venezuela. It has a structural problem that runs through the entire foundation of its global power. The American hegemon was built on three pillars. All three are now under stress. The first pillar is the petrodollar system. For 50 years, oil was priced exclusively in dollars. Every nation that wanted oil had to hold dollar. Every nation that held dollars had an incentive to maintain good relations with the United States. The system was self-reinforcing. The demand for dollars to buy oil created demand for American treasuries, the demand for American treasury bonds. Power partner can freeze your assets at will. You diversify away from that superpower. This is structural. It cannot be reversed by a new American president. It cannot be reversed by a stronger military posture. It can only accelerate. And here is what this means for Ukraine. As American financial leverage weakens, American willingness to spend unlimited resources on foreign wars weakens too. The empire is becoming thirsty. It needs to preserve capital. It needs to preserve credibility. It needs to show that American backing still means something. You cannot do that by bleeding yourself dry in Eastern Europe. Let me trace the logic of how America got here. After the Cold War ended, the United States made a choice. It chose unipolarity. It chose to maintain military superiority everywhere. It chose to expand NATO. It chose to encircle Russia. It chose to treat China as a rising threat to be contained. These were not mistakes. They were the logical choices of a superpower trying to preserve its dominance. But dominance requires resources. So America began printing dollars to pay for military bases across the world. Hundreds of them, thousands of troops, enormous defense budgets, wars in Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria, weapons to Taiwan, Japan, South Korea, the Philippines. The bill became astronomical, and here is the trap. America could only pay this bill because the dollar was the global reserve currency, because every central bank in the world held American treasuries, because the pro-dollar system forced oil producers to accept dollars. In other words, America was financing its own containment of rivals by borrowing from the world using its financial dominance. This is not sustainable. At some point, and we are reaching that point, the world realizes that lending to an empire that is simultaneously trying to contain you is not a profitable trade. So the world stops lending, or it lends less, or it demands higher interest rates. The American Treasury yield rises. The federal debt becomes harder to finance. And suddenly the empire has a choice. Keep spending on military dominance or keep the financial system functioning. You cannot do both. This is the structural constraint that is now binding American policy. This is why Ukraine is becoming expendable, not because of weakness of will, because of mathematics. The tools that built American hegemony, the dollar, the treasuries, the financial system, are now the noose tightening around its neck. In classical realist theory, there is a concept called relative power. It is not about absolute strength. It is about strength relative to your competitors. For 30 years, American relative power was overwhelming. The American military was stronger than the next 10 militaries combined. The American economy was larger than the next 3 combined. The American financial system was unchallengeable. Now this is changing. China's economy is approaching American levels. Russia's military capacity has proven more resilient than expected. And most importantly, the global south, which includes India, Brazil, Indonesia, Nigeria, and dozens of others, is no longer automatically siding with America because American dominance no longer guarantees their security. In fact, it guarantees their subordination. When you are a middle power, your rational choice is to align with the dominant power only if the dominant power can protect you from all threats. But when the dominant power is struggling to contain 2 rising powers simultaneously, and when the dominant power might use financial weapons against you, alignment becomes less attractive. So they hedge, they buy gold, they trade in local currencies, they deepen ties with China and Russia, they join BRICS, they build alternative payment systems. This is not ideological, it is strategic, it is rational. And what it means is every central bank in the world would hold dollar reserves. Those reserves would be parked in treasury bonds. The interest payments would be manageable because the dollar was essential. But when you weaponize the treasury bond system, when you freeze the assets of Russia, when you restrict Iran's access to the SWIFT system, when you threaten any nation that trades with your enemies, you create an incentive for every nation to reduce its dependence on dollar holding. Today, central banks around the world are diversifying away from dollar reserves into gold, into bilateral currency arrangements, into alternative payment systems. The more the United States relied on financial weaponization, the more rapid the exodus became. The sanctions regime itself was supposed to be a tool of coercion, isolate a nation, cut off its access to the global economy, force compliance. But every time the United States imposed sanctions, it demonstrated something crucial. The United States was willing to weaponize the system, and more importantly, it was possible to survive outside the system. Iran survived, North Korea survived. Russia adapted and found new trade partners. Venezuela discovered that China was willing to absorb its entire oil production. Each successful sanctions evasion proved to the next target that resistance was possible. This is not morality. This is not ideology. This is structural cause and effect. The tools that built the empire are now the noose tightening around its neck. Now let me explain what is actually happening in Venezuela right now and why China and Russia are allowing it to unfold the way it is. The United States expects that Venezuela will become unstable. The United States expects that instability will force a crisis. The United States expects that a crisis will create an opportunity for regime change. This is the American playbook. It worked in Iraq, it worked in Libya, it worked in Syria partially. The assumption is that if you can create enough pressure, something breaks. But this assumes that rivals are passive. This assumes that rivals do not have their own strategic plans. This assumes that rivals cannot prepare alternatives. China has spent the last 15 years positioning itself as the non-ideological patron of resource-rich nations. It does not care about the internal politics of Venezuela. It does not care about democracy or human rights. It cares about one thing: access to oil at stable prices through predictable trade relationship.